Welcome to our study of the book of Colossians. Today we're going to cover chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, which is Paul's greeting. Now, before we get started, it's important to remember that when Paul originally wrote this letter to the Colossians, there weren't any chapter divisions, and there weren't any verse divisions, and there weren't any headers, nothing like that. So when we say we're reading verses 1 through 14, the greeting, we're kind of making an estimate about what Paul's thought process is here. So during this study, we're kind of going to go verse by verse, but hopefully we're going to try to go more thought by thought. We're going to kind of break it down as you're going to see as we go through this. We'll start in verse 1, where we talk about Paul and his disciple, Timothy. Now, Paul and Timothy were inseparable during this time, and Paul even went so far as to call Timothy his son in the faith. In Acts 16, verses 1 through 4, Paul spent some time in a place called Lystra, and while he was there, he met a young man named Timothy. And Timothy's mom was a Jew, but his dad was a Greek, but he ended up converting to Christianity. He became a disciple of Jesus and kind of an understudy to the Apostle Paul. And from that point on, the two of them went everywhere together. And so it's cool in this book because you see Paul's probably in prison, and he labels the book Paul and Timothy. And what that probably means is that Paul was telling Timothy what to write down. Timothy was probably like his scribe during this time. Another interesting point is that Lystra, the place that Timothy was from, was not so far away from the city of Colossae, which is the town that Paul's writing this letter to. So it's very possible that these Christians would have known about Timothy through some other kind of means, or maybe they'd seen him before, something like that. So all that stuff's kind of interesting about this book. And in verses 3 through 6, Paul's going to talk about some reasons why he's excited to write to the Colossians. He says he's excited to hear about their love and their hope of heaven, and most importantly, that the gospel is bearing fruit in their lives. And that kind of language is interesting in this book because Paul writes the same kind of thing in other places in his writings. In 1 Corinthians 13:13, he talks about how one day these things will be gone away with, and we're going to be left with faith, hope, and love, and how those three things are better than any spiritual gift that we can be given. And that language is very similar to verses 3 through 6 here. He's excited about their love for each other, their hope of heaven, and bearing fruit, that the gospel's bearing fruit. So interesting that these things are lining up as Paul is writing these to different churches. And then in verses 7 through 8, we get back to this character named Epaphras. Now, in our last video, the background of the book of Colossians, we talked a lot about this character named Epaphras, and we're not going to spend as much time on him here. So if you haven't seen that video already, we would encourage you to pause this video, go back and watch that one to have a better understanding of who Epaphras was. Epaphras was solely responsible for bringing the gospel to the city of Colossae. As we discussed a little bit last video, he probably met Paul when he was in Ephesus during Acts 19, 1 through 10. And what's so cool about this situation is that Paul is in no way jealous or upset that he did not start the Colossian church. As a matter of fact, Paul's excited that the gospel is just spreading. As a matter of fact, he has that same kind of conversation in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. Because in the Corinthian church, people were kind of splintering up into different groups of who their favorite preacher was. And I know we're not guilty of that today, right? We never do that. But they had that same problem back in the first century. People were saying, well, I like Paul's style of preaching. Well, I like Apollos' style of preaching. And, well, I like Peter's style of preaching. And Paul has to break through all that noise and say, wait a minute, who is the one who died for you? It wasn't Paul. It wasn't any of the other guys. It was Christ. So instead of following us, why don't you follow Christ instead? And as a minister, I think I had the space to say this, but ministers can learn a great lesson from this, because sometimes, I think if we're honest, we get jealous of each other. You know, who's preaching where, and how much money is he making compared to how much money I'm making? And, well, he has a bigger congregation than I do. He lives in a better place than I do. And if Paul was living today, he would say, who cares? Who cares? The gospel is spreading. Do your work here where you've been assigned, and forget about the rest. Be excited for them, encourage them, write to them, associate with them. And that's just a great lesson for the modern church that we can take away from that. And moving to verses 9 through 11, we get Paul's specific prayer for the Colossians. We get an insight into what he was thinking when he went to God on their behalf. He wants them to be filled with the knowledge of God's will. He wants them to have spiritual wisdom and understanding. He wants them to be strengthened with power, and he wants them to have endurance, patience, and joy. And as with Paul's other prayers to different churches, this prayer was extremely specific. He knew what their needs were, he knew what was going on in their time and their territory, and he prayed for very specific things for them. And it all kind of culminates in why he's praying for them in the first place in verse 10, which is he wants them to be able to walk in a worthy manner. That is, to live the right kind of life according to their calling. And I think if we're being honest, sometimes as modern believers, our prayers tend to be kind of generic. We'll say, bless so-and-so, or thank you for this food, and we kind of just do run-of-the-mill prayers. But with Paul, it seems like he spent a lot of time praying, and he was very specific about what he was praying and who he was praying for. And modern Christians can take a great lesson from that. It's okay to be generic sometimes. We just need to say, thank you, Lord, all those kind of things. But other times we need to be more specific when we're talking to the creator of our universe. And wrapping up this section in verses 12 through 14, Paul's going to talk about the source of all these good things. And the language in these verses should remind us of the wilderness wandering. He's talking about once being in darkness, but then being transported into the kingdom, once being apart and now being drawn close. It should kind of remind us of the Israelites in the wilderness, that they were once seeking the promised land and now God's drawn them close to giving them a home. And that's kind of the imagery that maybe Paul is trying to get across to them here. And there are two key words that stand out in this passage: kingdom and inheritance. Paul wants them to know that there is more to live for than just the physical. And this idea of having an inheritance waiting for you and being part of a greater kingdom would have been extremely appealing to an ancient reader. Because if you were rich, you had a huge inheritance waiting on you. You had land and money, all those good things. But most people back in that time didn't really have a lot waiting on them. When their parents passed away, it was like, well, there's some family heirlooms, which are nice, but nothing really substantial. But what Paul's getting across here is that God's building an entire kingdom for us, and we're a part of it. And when we do our due diligence, when we carry through our faithful side of this transaction, this covenant that we have with him, he's giving us an inheritance far greater than anything we could ever deserve. And so closing this greeting, Paul wants them to know that God is the source of all these good things that they now have through Christ. And that concludes our study on the greeting of the letter of the Colossians. We would encourage you to go ahead and read forward to Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23. And in that section, we're going to talk about King Jesus. Paul's going to be placing Jesus above everybody else. And remember, this study is coming with a study component as well. We have a study guide for you that can be found in the link in the description below this video, or it can be found on the webpage that we're posting this on our website. And also, if you need a physical copy of those things, then see me on Sunday or Wednesday, and we'll try and get those things to you. Hope you've enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time.